Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I'm your host, Dr. Valerie Nyberg, and today I have with us LaDeetra Kincy. LaDeetra is an experienced educator in both multiple subjects and special education. Over the past dozen years, she has supported students in a variety of educational needs using her multiple subjects and special education credentials, in which she is licensed in California, Texas, and Wyoming. She also has her principal licensure. Really awesome. In 2020, she completed her graduate degree in educational leadership at Western Governors University. In that program, she completed her thesis called Training Teachers to Select Culturally Relevant Curriculum for African American Homeschool Families. During her thesis, Ms. Kincy collected survey data from a select teaching population pre-training and post-training to determine if their perspectives about culturally relevant curriculum changed. Her data indicated that after completing the training, teachers increased their ability to make recommendations of culturally relevant curriculum options available to their students. As we know, this is such an important topic, and so many educators across the country are struggling and dealing with this in real time. So I'm sure that your thesis has been downloaded and reviewed by several people. So LaDeetra, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you decided to become a teacher?
Oh, thank you, Dr. Valerie, for that warm welcome. I really appreciate your time and thank you for inviting me to speak with you today.
Absolutely.
So, my educational journey, actually becoming a teacher, is my second career.
Mhm.
I came to it later on, I would say, after holding different positions in administrative assistant jobs, or receptionist jobs, working
Mhm.
for banking, all of those fields. But what really motivated me to consider a position in education is just one, I have always been a helper,
Mhm.
a support. I also have always in my life overall, I would say people that I've come in contact with, friends and family, whenever they've had children, I've always leaned into educational items versus maybe your general toys.
Right.
But I think the change for me happened as I was completing my associate's degree
Mhm.
um, at Sacramento City College. I took the first, introductory to child development course, and I found that not only the information but the work spoke to me in terms of what I could bring to it. Whereas I'm thinking about not only support but also increasing my ability to aid students in achieving their academic goals. So
Mhm.
that's something that I've always enjoyed, and I think being in this position has allowed me to use some of my gifts in that area.
That's awesome. That's so important. I think we forget that often people have a journey that is not necessarily straight or evident when you get started, but through, I mean, that's the beautiful thing about education. Through education, through opportunities and access, we can start to navigate that path in more meaningful and self-fulfilling ways. So that's really awesome. um, as a special education teacher serving the needs of students across K-12 spectrum, how do you approach that task of meeting your students' various needs?
It is a depth and breadth to the grade
Mm.
band, right? Because I'm essentially serving students kindergarten all the way to their 22nd birthday. So the way that I lean into that, and even in college, I found that being credentialed as a general education teacher and as well as a special education teacher, once I walked into that room, I immediately wanted to make all of the small groups work with children in not so much the large group, but also individualize their education because all of us are unique, right? And the
Right.
way in which we go about learning is that also. And so why I wanted generally to ensure that students on an individual level got what they need. I
Mhm.
found that pull more than I did teaching to the many. That's not to say that, that's the nature of our craft to teach to the many,
Right.
but when I was in the classroom, I immediately wanted to have small group, create community, and really work with students on a one-on-one basis so that I could ensure that they had the accommodations, that they had the support, that they had the tools that they needed to really be the best student they could be. So once I got there, I kind of felt that my inclination naturally was to work with students like on a one-on-one basis or in a small group
Right.
setting. And that's kind of continued in the way that I do my work.
That's awesome. I think there is a special quality about that work that I think sometimes gets lost in all of the paperwork and the bureaucracy and the management of what it looks like and how it's implemented. So like really just wanting to get down to that individual student is a very, very unique and special gift. So what hacks do you employ as you help your students and meet their needs?
I would say now, because I had a prior kind of career before I came to education, I lean heavily into like technology.
Mhm.
Oh, as I was exploring, before I became a teacher, I had other interests, as a lot of people do. And I tended to lean into technology, into tech, into computers. My mother had a computer background growing up. So I think that interest was there for me. So things like, something as simple as voice typing, right? When you're using Google Docs. Some people may know that that is available to all people. However, they might not be using that particular feature. And even for when I was in graduate school, I tended to lean into using hacks or apps or technology to help me get through, writing papers, writing the thesis, things like that, because it's a universal tool. So I would say I lean heavily into not only the specific needs of the student, but also things like voice typing that is universal for a lot of students to use, not just students, but also everyone.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. I don't think that most people understand the assistive technology that's more universal these days because you don't necessarily access it unless you quote unquote need it. But
Mm,
there are so many people who would probably be in a different place or access different things if they just knew that it was there for them to use
mhm.
and and used it often. Um,
Absolutely. I think the read feature, there are extensions in Chrome
mhm,
where you can add a read to you text where it's going to highlight the word as it reads it on a page that you're looking at on a website. So again, that's something that many people may not know is available, but if they have access to it and they're aware of how to use it, they might lean into the support.
so I do have a another question. This is with general education teachers, which I've worked mostly with those with general education teachers. There's a sense that these are cheating, or these tools, are kind of provide too much support to students. What do you say to those folks who look at these as well, we're really helping them out too much?
I've heard that many times over my career. I will probably continue to hear that feedback as I continue to be a part of this community of educators. What I will say is that if we all use something like a ladder, right? All of us may not be as tall as some of us. Some of us need a step to get to that cabinet, that item. That tool is there for everyone to use, because someone might be shorter doesn't mean that they shouldn't have access to the cupboard because they use a step stool. And I think it's similarly when it comes to these educational tools. The educational tools are there in support of, they help students. They're not trying to evade learning. They're
Mhm.
trying to empower students and their independence to be able to take care of and understand the language that's coming at them when it comes to any content area, whether that's math or science or what have you. But those tools are available just like a dictionary is available to all of us. So having those universal tools like a step stool, step ladder, or a dictionary or a read to you feature, it
Mhm.
benefits us all. And I argue it's better to have the ability to access items that will help you be a better student, and we shouldn't create barriers to that.
I completely and totally agree. I wish more people saw it as an additive,
Mm,
as a benefit for everyone,
mhm,
and less as a crutch for some.
mhm,
And I think that's the mentality, that mentality that keeps people from seeing really what assets those tools can be to a learner who would otherwise struggle and otherwise feel like they can't learn, or feel
mhm.
like they're not smart, or feel like
Yeah.
they can't, insert that negative self-talk,
Mhm.
so that they can actually do and be more than they ever thought without it. So,
I completely agree.
so what does it mean to work remotely?
Well, I think remote work is in the eye of the beholder, probably. Uh,
Mhm,
all of the educators that I have worked with or been in community with over my various types of jobs that I've held in education,
mhm,
all of us were kind of thrusted into remote work. But actually, myself, I had a little bit of an introduction prior to that while I was working for a homeschool. In that kind of type of school, parents assume responsibility of instructing their students at
mhm,
home. And myself as an educator, I help to support the parent in those curriculum decisions and those decisions about how maybe their individual education plan for their child will be applied,
mhm,
given that they're in this different setting of a school, and making sure that I do that in this remote space is different. So there was some flexibility in my job prior at a homeschool where I would visit homes of the families that I would be supporting, and that could be, anywhere in my region, let's say.
mhm,
Um, when that slightly switched, it was because we also had a physical site that we would go to and meet at, but we were encouraged to be out in community with our learners and our families. So it was less of a, I would say, priority for us to be seated at a desk in a building where people come to meet us. And
right.
the other was what at the time my administrator wanted was for us to go into community and talk to people and support them where they were, whether that was local libraries, whether that was at community centers, whether that was in the home of our families. So when COVID hit, we weren't able to do that much traveling, right? So we
Right.
didn't have that face-to-face option in home that we used to. So we ended up starting to do some of our meetings virtually. And then that kind of expanded when we went totally remote. So then in that time, I really tried to lean into making more meaningful connections to my families. And what I mean meaningful, I really mean taking the time to really ask them how they are.
Yeah.
A lot of times, especially during COVID, a lot of people, because they weren't able to connect, were feeling extremely isolated. And
Mhm,
not only that, there were health concerns, and some of students and families that I work with lost loved ones. And so, for as much as I wanted to support them academically, I realized that I needed to lean in to be a listener and an encourager for those families so that they could still continue their educational journeys. Because sometimes when those trauma happens, you freeze or I can't deal with this.
right.
But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you're looking at it, we still have to try our best to continue to make progress. And so I think coupling the increase in really contact, whether that was phone calls, whether that was text messages, whether that was emails, whether that was more Zooms, um, I try to provide that support. And it turns out that a lot of families really needed it at the time. And some of those meetings that we would be doing that we would typically hold in the field or home visits ended up being Zooms, and they ended up being longer. So I had to schedule such that because not only were parents talking to me, so were their children. And I just had to expand in that way. And I actually appreciated that because I think the quality of my work also increased and I got better outcomes because of it.
So I want to dig in a little bit more into that first, because I think many people have misunderstandings of what homeschool parents are like or homeschool environment is like. So can you
Mhm.
describe kind of what, like, who's attracted to homeschooling? What are some of the reasons for homeschooling versus a more traditional setting? Can you get a little bit, describe that a little bit more?
Absolutely. I came to homeschool after teaching first out of college at a non-public school setting for a
Mhm,
number of years, then to an independent charter school, and
mhm,
then to a homeschool that was independent charter, and then was initially dependent charter, excuse me, for the district, and
mhm.
then became independent. But
What's the difference between dependent and independent?
so funding and who is supporting.
Okay.
So dependent would be dependent on your district or
Okay.
unified school district, independent school district, or being independent as a school means that you are not dependent on the district for your funding. You want to make decisions about how the money is spent. And I think that's the easiest way to
Mm,
illustrate the difference between the two. For
okay.
the homeschool environment, the actual parents, they varied. They varied from being single parents, two-parent households. They varied in location, whether that was a little bit what people consider rural areas to more city areas as well.
Mhm.
They traverse between age and also um, diverse backgrounds. I think a lot of the motivating factor for parents were when I would ask them, hey, what made you decide to come to homeschool? A lot of the responses that I received were based on some of the horror stories or
Oof.
um, inconsistencies they had at their traditional school. And they really wanted an opportunity to look at education differently and have more of a voice
Mm,
around what their students learned. Some families wanted more flexibility in talking about heritage. Some families wanted a little bit more flexibility in the type of curriculum was chosen for math by different publishers. Some families wanted to be able to use a certain kind of curriculum for spelling skills. So it varied, but having a educator partner with a parent
mhm.
to address the needs of their student is essentially, I think, what a lot of our educational system should be working towards, because that way you address the needs of the parent and you address the needs of the student in concert. Um, and that's what I enjoyed about it. And I was there for about 7 years. So as we switched to a more remote model,
Mhm.
some families stayed with uh, the homeschool and some departed to go back to traditional school because they wanted a little bit more consistency of day, time, schedule, and what their students would be given in terms of support or curriculum and things of that nature. But what I discovered is that while some families decided to leave, some decided to stay,
Mhm.
and some decided to stay remote versus the opportunity that they had to go back to traditional school. And so I think as we move forward in education, having conversations around what's in the best interest of this child, whether that's remote hybrid or going to a traditional site, sometimes having the availability of having some courses virtually,
Mhm.
or a non-public school setting or a charter school. All of these options are available, but it's about understanding what the differences are as it relates to your child and finding the right place for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, as a secondary person myself, I think these options are really wonderful to have. at that secondary, that older child level. But it occurs to me that you work a lot with younger children. So do you worry, or is there a place to worry about the quality of instruction, those early years, and making sure they have that foundation in that homeschool or alternative environment versus a more traditional one?
I think that can be true in all of these settings,
Mhm.
not just one or the other. I will say that sure, in a remote only environment for, a kindergartner, they need that socialization. They
Mhm.
need to be able to look at the environment around them and take in information through all their senses because of where they are developmentally.
Mhm.
I would say for, older elementary school students, second or third or fourth grade,
Mhm.
some of the ones that I have come in contact with, of course, we're meeting virtually now, but even prior to that, they had some basic knowledge of computers and already may have attended some services virtually through additional occupational therapy or speech or things of that nature. Because even prior to COVID, when I was still at a seat based site,
Mhm.
it took a little bit of time for me to get comfortable with having services being provided virtually versus face to face as well. So it wasn't something that I came to quickly. It took years. I do think a combination maybe would be better, or even to look at, hey, what are the opportunities for children in the various grade spans to access more experienced educators
Mhm.
that are not currently where they live, because that even takes us to staffing and things like that, whereas there are less educators available but the need is still the same.
Right.
So how are we going to reimagine how we do this thing called education for the children that really need it the most?
Yeah. Yeah. One more homeschool experience question.
Sure.
But you talked about doing home visits, and how in the pandemic you started to really lean into asking your families how they were doing, and getting more involved. Do you feel like that changed the power dynamics of being able to really meet them on a personal level and one-to-one level versus the traditional objectivity of I am the educator, you are the parent, I am, the teacher, you are the student. um, like, can you describe what that experience was like a little bit more?
Yes, it's definitely a shift in dynamic, absolutely.
Hmm.
Because sometimes I would say education is kind of looked at in an authoritative kind of
Hmm.
view, right? I lean into collaboration.
Hmm.
Again, I think it's one of my strengths, it's one of my gifts. I need to listen, to learn, to ensure not only the feedback from the parent educator that's there in the home, I also need them to be comfortable with whether they are making some positive choices or some challenging choices. But I want them to feel comfortable enough to say, okay, we tried this and it didn't really work out the way that I thought. How can we course correct?
Hmm.
The way that you ensure that people are comfortable with you is really to ask them and meet them where they are.
Hmm.
I had one parent of mine that has multiple children in her home. And when I asked this particular parent, how are you doing? How are things going?
Hmm.
Immediately, I got the response of, no one has asked me that in months.
Mm.
And the weight of someone outside of their home environment to check in, like, how
Mhm.
are you? How are things going? How are the children? What are some of the life impacts that are changing the way or um, challenging the way that you're instructing your student?
Mhm.
What's happening behaviorally? What's happening in the family unit? that you're comfortable sharing, or that may change how you make decisions or why you make decisions.
Mhm.
And I found that through, again, year to year, having that rapport and really leaning into finding out how my families were,
Mhm.
it actually created a better bond, I would say, and
Mhm.
respect in terms of what suggestions I made or what questions I asked about what was happening. There wasn't a, I don't want to tell you XYZ because I think you're going to grade my student negatively, or you're going to say that we're not attending, or you're going to, kick us out. And
Mhm.
what will we do? Instead, it was, how are the lessons going? Is this information being absorbed? How do you know? Let's test that. Let's quiz that in a non kind of uh threatening way, but in a way that just, hey, show me what you know. That's what this is about. Being the best you can as a learner, and giving me information and I learned from correct answers and incorrect answers,
Mhm.
because what that actually means is this is where we need to start making different choices around how this material is being presented.
Mhm.
And that in turn helps the parent and helps the student. So um, for me, it helped in what suggestions I was making, what recommendations I was making, and what feedback I received about that, and how I could add strategies or take them away based on what I received in the feedback.
Interesting. And you mentioned earlier that you had better outcomes. So you saw, I'm assuming you saw more growth in your students and more retention of the material. Is that what you mean?
Yes, because most of the time when it came to a lot of the students that I supported, I would be doing little, not high stakes tests, but I would
Mhm.
be doing, um,
Formative assessments.
yes, you right, formative assessment. That's what I was searching for. Not formative assessment, but informative, right? Being able to ask them specific questions based on the content that they had been going over for the month, and trying to ascertain how much they retained. And some of that would be given to me written, some of that would be given to me verbally, some of that would be given to me in a thematic unit kind of way.
Mhm.
So adjusting how I, as an educator, took in information and determined, hey, yes, the student is making measurable change and growth based on their own information. So, yes, there would be that comparison for other students in that grade level, but really the comparison should be that and how the student is actually doing themselves. So
Right.
they are working on improving themselves every day. And how do we track that? How do we measure that um, in the same way that we measure and give the same validity to, some of those formal assessments?
That is really important, but I don't want to digress into that conversation. What's the
Another
biggest?
day, another
Yeah,
day.
right. Today, what's the biggest lesson you've learned throughout your 12 years in education?
Um, I would say that the reason that I do this work um, has kind of given me a foundation
Hmm.
to stay. And I know that can be a challenge, especially now for a lot of educators because of what they experienced. I know, during COVID, I really think it was more about capacity for a lot of educators because they were already working in a system that, doesn't have the appropriate funding they might need, doesn't have the appropriate staff they might need, maybe has outdated curriculum, or if it's new curriculum, it's new to them.
Right.
Um, and and working with students from a varied set of backgrounds that require different support and compassion. So for me, leaning into one, that all children, whether they are neurotypical or not,
Mhm.
are going through the development to become young adults. We're watching them do that. But the way in which we support them in a maybe more of a coaching way,
Mhm.
maybe more of a collaborative way, um, I think overall helps the outcome not only for the student, but also the family. Um, and and when we get to that place on a more consistent level, I do feel like we'll have better outcomes.
I completely agree. I think the thing that my brain goes to, particularly since, I've been a administrator, is
Mm.
how do you scale that up? What I see at the secondary level is, I mean, I believe that we can do that. I believe that's good practice, and that is definitely what our students are needing and wanting, and what is good and healthy for our educators. But that requires so much more manpower than we currently have in education, and just restructuring building wise, how we hire, how we observe, how we provide feedback. It All of those structures have to become much more nimble and flexible than they currently are. And I think, is it ever realistic to really be able to get to that place? Because I do think we'll have better outcomes, but we actually have to have the public will to support that kind of change.
I agree with you. It is in a local school, in
Mhm.
a community school, it requires the help of not only the people in the building, but the people that live around the building.
Right.
And it can be, sometimes a challenge for engagement, depending on where you live, depending on um, what the needs of the community are. I've worked in low socioeconomic schools my whole career, and I'll continue to do that um, because of the need. The need is such that you lend yourself to it, but then you also at the same time have to think about your own capacity. And you mentioned that earlier, and I think uh, that is a lot of the reason why educators have left the field pre-COVID. We're leaving the field during COVID, and the staffing shortages remain. Um, but I also think that's a mindset shift collectively as a society in terms of not only how we treat our children, but how do we treat our educators, uh,
Right.
and what are our expectations of them, and why we have them, and how we can be more realistic and compassionate as well.
Yeah, I think whether it's Frary or whatever philosopher or theorist, the banking model, the factory model of education doesn't work. It doesn't work for the workers. It doesn't work for the students. It doesn't necessarily work for the families. But that efficiency, quote unquote, is what keeps it in place. And I think if we could just, like you said earlier, marshal the resources that technology provides, and marshal, the gifts that we all have to do this work, and the risk taking. I think that's another thing, is all of what we're talking about now requires a great amount of risk taking that I don't know that everyone is well suited for.
Mm.
Is kind of that precipice of where we are right now, of all of those things coming together. What do you think?
There is definitely a coalescing of all of those topics that you mentioned.
Mhm.
And, you know, in 2020, there was some awakening and reevaluation around, how African Americans in this country continue to be treated, that our experience sometimes is different and set apart from other Americans in this country.
Mhm.
So I think that happening while COVID happening, and just looking at the educational system in the lens is the perfect
Tsunami.
tsunami wave, whatever metaphor you want to try to use, for us to really reevaluate and
Mhm.
realign. And I think that's also a piece that um, maybe we're not talking as much about, that COVID also gave some people that may not have had an opportunity to stop and pause and really think about what kind of work they were doing, what kind of things were going on in the world, how people that were different, in terms of maybe their lifestyle, or maybe, what kind of work they did changed, and what does that mean? And I think in that reevaluation, a lot of people really thought about, okay, why am I doing this job? Fill in the blank. Um, does this really feed me, support me spiritually, or am I connected to this work? Why or why not? So I think the situation lent itself to some some deep reflection, and out of that deep reflection comes, hopefully more change to better the system. I think a lot of school districts and a lot of people were kind of scrambling during 2020 and during social distancing and quarantine, because they had never considered doing education a different way.
Mhm.
Uh, for me, it wasn't as much of a jolt, but it was a jolt nonetheless.
Right.
But the degree that I felt it was different, because I had kind of been meandering through, different types of educational options, so that I could speak to that when people ask me, what's going on at a non-public school, what's going on at a homeschool, what's going on at a seat-based charter, what's going on in the unified school district. So I think in our need to ensure that, let's make sure everybody's got Chromebooks. Let's make sure, everybody's got MiFis. Let's make sure, and yes, let's make sure we have, the right curriculum online. What are we doing? Are we, casting teachers? Are we gonna, work with a company that's, providing that, and we support? So, but that was in a reactive mode. It wasn't in a preemptive mode. I think now that we have these different options for students to either go to school remotely, do a hybrid, or have a seat-based model, now that we're kind of not in the quick reactive mode, let's think about how we can continue to offer options, but more effectively, for the grade spans that need it.
Mm. Yeah.
And then that might kind of let us look at our ratio of students in the building. And then that might help us with our staffing. So there are ways to look at education differently. However, I think maybe now, it almost, getting ready to finish out this 22 year into 23, maybe we can start making adjustments now that we have more options.
Mhm.
That would be my hope. And even as myself, I'm trying to work on a project to give people access to a quality experience special educator that they can ask questions of, that they can, well, my student has problem with reading, or oh, math, or oh, how do we offer that? Because the the pool of people, the collection of people that are still committed to the work are available, but the access to them is different. So I'm trying to work on that and, give support again to students, to families, parents, and also other educators that are still kind of feeling like, okay, I did this, but I don't really know if this remote thing worked out. How do I really look at that? How do I reflect? How do I how do I become better if this
Right.
is how I'm going to keep the modality of how I instruct students?
Mhm.
So I think that comes into play as we continue to move through the system, even as I continue to work in education, that those opportunities are available to
Mm.
all people.
Yeah, yeah. I want to be transparent and admit that we met while getting our hair done.
Hey.
But what the genesis of that conversation was navigating that system as Black women in this time, and how it seems that in our conversation at that point that we've both kind of come to this conclusion that the system necessarily isn't the place. So there's this need or want or desire to build an alternative to that, that you can, where you can be yourself and be the confident person you know you can be, as well as do the work that you're most passionate about. And so I wanted to give you that, maybe have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about that from your end, and how you're going, what the things that you're doing to go in that direction.
So just like you, Dr. Valerie, I, would like to continue to help students, help families become more comfortable navigating the system of education,
Mm-hmm.
but also really making sure that their children, from a parent's perspective, their children really have the opportunity of choice and access in terms of, I can get my question answered without feeling bad that I don't know the answer to this question that I thought I should know the answer to because someone thought I knew it.
Right.
And I am always like, ask the question, whatever it is. But a lot of people may not have had that kind of open, judgmental less way to come to not only their questions about education, but also questions around special education. What does it mean? You have this document. What does that mean? We have this, eligibility. What are they eligible for? So I would like to um, definitely offer, and I'm working towards, trying to build something in terms of a community, in terms of a company, in terms of um, a place, an environment for people to be able to get those questions answered and to be able to feel like they are prepared and empowered to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
That is the point. You What you don't know can hurt you, even though we hope that it doesn't, but it may. But if you have been, how can we reevaluate that and turn and shift that mindset to say, now that you have these tools, now that you have this information, what decisions are you going to make differently based on educating yourself about, you know, this system, and lifting the veil on that, and not feeling like, oh, I'm just, dropping the kids off and then the teacher will handle it. It'll be fine, or for the teacher, I need help. I wish I had a parent or a para or somebody to help me. So trying to figure that out and offering maybe, educational consultant, or, you know, time and a series of sessions that will help specifically around a certain skill building, whether that's reading, whether that's math, because of those high stakes areas based on testing, right?
Hmm.
Um, Either way, I realized that some of my own promotion in, various schools that I worked at was not just determined upon the education, not just the experience, but someone giving you the opportunity.
Hmm.
Someone has to say, "Oh, I think Dr. Valerie is perfect for this."
Right.
They have to give you the chance. And sometimes we don't get the chances. And then the promotion ends up coming by you deciding to promote yourself and the work based on the need. Um, that's how I believe we're going to see some changes as well, because educators that have been doing this work for years understand the pain points, but they're not able to have the resources to fix the pain points they see.
Right. 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 So before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to mention that we didn't quite get into?
Um, in reference to the thesis, I would say that writing a thesis is like writing a book. I didn't know that until I did it, and I know the dissertation is way, way a lot. But I will say, going into it, I wasn't sure that the teachers that I surveyed initially before the training that we put together using um, Gloria Laston Billings' work
Hmm.
uh, throughout my thesis and in the training that I provided to the teachers. I didn't initially think that I would see, any changes in the way they perceived culturally relevant curriculum, but I was pleasantly surprised. And I still hold the hope that that's possible too, that even in various states where they're talking about, what to teach regarding the history of our country, I think all voices from all perspectives should be considered and honored, because we all live here together. And
Right.
it's not about one view, it's about the many.
And that's, I mean, the ironic thing is that's the foundation and the core of this country is, the many and the multitude have a voice and are able to exercise that voice and that will. And I don't really understand why that feels threatening to some, because that's the great American experiment after all.
Well, that is definitely why people come to our country, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. To have a to have more freedom, to have a better life, to be able to express themselves,
To be safe.
to yeah, to be safe. I mean, yesterday, bird walk. Yesterday, I met a gentleman who's from Iran, and his daughter, they own a sewing and vacuum cleaner store. I had to go get something really quick, and
Mm,
I asked him about the coverage in our media about Iran, and he said, what coverage? There really isn't any coverage.
mm,
He said, yes, right now they're talking about the protests that are happening, but there's so much more going on than is what's being shown. And he said, I hope right now that this is a moment of revolution
mm,
for that country, because there have been so many things that have been under the radar that the United States hasn't really portrayed or shown or expressed. And he said that's one of the reasons why he came here, was to be
mm,
able to have that knowledge and that information and that freedom. And I
mhm,
thought, as much as I do think our country is very ethnocentric in our approach. We do have a lot more freedom and a lot more ability to um, become self-actualized than other people in other parts of the world. And at this moment in history, in human history, this is, I think, the golden moment, because you can really become fully self-actualized. It's not
Mm,
just a theory; it can be a reality.
mm,
Um, and I think the United States has done a remarkable job of bringing that into existence through the ways we've structured our culture, and or some of the ways we've structured our culture, and some of the ways we've structured our government particularly. um, it's going to be interesting the next 20 years.
it is. And, you know, my hope um, would be that we lean in
Mm,
to the shop maker, the Iranian shop maker, you know, that we lean into listening and
mhm,
really reflecting on, you know, indiv- individuals, but really also collectively. Like
mhm,
the reason that he came was because of some of the freedoms we enjoy, but those freedoms we also have to have conversations around how everyone is interpreting that, because
yeah,
perspective is just that, and a lived experience is important too. But we also could compare and contrast, right, in this moment, where we sit and um, what's happening around our world,
mhm,
and expand the view, not just of what's happening in our country, but what's happening around us, because we live on one planet Earth.
right.
We do, even though there are folks that can go to, you know, different levels of our atmosphere, we still live on Earth, and this is the only planet, the only home we've ever known. And we we do need to start thinking about that, and how individually and collectively that can be better here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I sincerely thank you for taking your time to talk with me. I feel like we've had a really substantive conversation, and thank you for being willing to sit down with me today.
Absolutely, Dr. Valerie. Thank you so much for the invite. It has been a pleasure.
Awesome. This has been another episode of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions, and I'm your host, Dr. Valerie Nyberg. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. Please feel free to like, share, or comment on this episode, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you so much.